Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session of Online with LSE. My name is Logan Gin, and I come to you all from Arizona State University, where I recently completed my PhD in biology education. And I'm thrilled to serve today as the moderator for today's session of Online with LSE. So before we begin, I would just like to remind everyone that um, in the audience that the goal of this webinar is to be some sort of a journal club to provide some behind the scenes insights into biology education studies. I would also strongly encourage everyone to submit questions as we go to contribute to the discussion. And that allows us to drive these conversations. So please make an active use of the Q&A feature to submit your questions, and we'll work to synthesize the questions and make them visible as we go. So now I'm thrilled to introduce today's featured author, who is Dr. Mariel Pfeifer. And Dr. Mariel Pfeifer recently completed her PhD at the University of Georgia, where she was dually trained in biology education research and fungal cellular biology. She earned her bachelor's degrees from the University of Wyoming in microbiology, biology, and secondary education. And before applying to graduate school, Mariel worked as a coordinator in a disability resource center. She is now a postdoc working with Dr. Aaron Dolan at the University of Georgia. And today, Mariel will share us a closer look behind the scenes of her recent and yet very important work on factors that support and hinder the self-advocacy of undergraduates with ADHD and learning disabilities in STEM. Welcome, Mariel. We're really excited to have you today as our featured author.
Thank you so much, Logan, for that kind introduction. I am so honored today to be sharing some of the work from our team. So I'll just go ahead and get started by providing a short overview of our work. And so this study was part of a larger investigation regarding the self-advocacy experiences of STEM undergraduates. And so as a prequel to the study we're talking about today, in our first paper, we really tried to address this research question. What is self-advocacy for STEM undergraduates with ADHD and or SLD? And ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and SLD is a specific learning disorder. And some other names for these are like dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia. And so in our first study, we generated a conceptual model of self-advocacy that we actually use in this particular paper as a model to define what self-advocacy is for our participants and to ask more research questions. And so you might be wondering what self-advocacy is, and a definition of self-advocacy is the identification, pursuit, and receipt of needed supports to access learning. And so here is a summary of the conceptual model of self-advocacy that we developed in our first paper. And so through an empirical test of an existing model of self-advocacy, we were really able to refine and tailor a model for STEM undergraduates with ADHD and or SLD. And so in this work, we found that self-advocacy for this particular group of students was made up of knowledge, beliefs, and behaviors. And so for self-advocacy knowledge, there were some different forms that was important for self-advocacy, or what we thought of as defining self-advocacy. And this included knowledge of self, which is like an awareness of your own strengths and weaknesses as a learner with ADHD or SLD. Knowledge of rights, which is an awareness of the federal laws that drive or guide the accommodation process in college. And then knowledge of accommodations, which was a new part of the self-advocacy model. And here, knowledge of accommodations, we found that students self-advocacy required an awareness of the types of accommodations you can request as a student with ADHD or SLD, and an awareness of how accommodations are requested or the process for obtaining them. And so that includes knowledge of the student role, the DRC role, and the instructor role. And then we also found that knowledge of STEM learning context is an important part of self-advocacy. And so here, This is defined as an awareness of all the different environments a STEM undergraduate might encounter during their STEM major. So this includes, knowledge of the lecture section, the lab section, the discussion section, or even, like an independent research lab. And so those were some of the forms of knowledge that we found. Self-advocacy beliefs included view of disability, which is how an individual student considered their own disability and how they perceived others to perceive individuals with ADHD or SLD, as well as agency was another self-advocacy belief. And we define this as a belief that an individual student is ultimately responsible for their own success in a STEM course. And there were also self-advocacy behaviors. So communication, which is bolded because we really see this as the heart of self-advocacy, as well as leadership and filling gaps were some other examples. And so we use this model to define what self-advocacy was. And in this second, and I should just share a little bit about why self-advocacy is important and why we want to study it. And so we know that the accommodation process in college is a lot different from the accommodation process in high school. And so some students may be entering into college with limited knowledge of how the accommodation process works in college, which would affect self-advocacy. Self-advocacy is also known to be important for success in college. And so there's a few papers that find that self-advocacy is the only predictor of academic GPA for college students with disabilities. And we also know that students with disabilities are equally interested in STEM majors as students without disabilities, yet relatively few will graduate with a STEM degree. And there's some evidence that suggests that students with disabilities in STEM majors are actually less likely to use accommodations compared to students with disabilities in other majors. And so our hope is that by understanding self-advocacy and what influences it, it can help us to create more inclusive experiences that could support the retention of students with disabilities in STEM majors. And so we, in this particular study, our participants were 25 STEM majors who were registered with a campus disability resource center. And all of our participants were receiving services or eligible to receive services for ADHD or SLD. However, at the time data were collected, not all of our participants were currently using accommodations in their STEM courses. And I would just offer that this was a really important part of this study because we were able to learn a lot about some of their experiences and what factors were influencing their self-advocacy. And so to conduct this study, we used semi-structured interviews with our 25 participants. And the average length of the interview was 80 minutes long. And so we analyzed our data using a highly iterative process that involved coding to consensus. And importantly, our team consisted of at least one or more researchers who was or were a STEM major with ADHD or SLD. And we saw this as a really important piece of our analysis because there was some critical expertise about the lived experiences of our participants. And in these last two slides, I just kind of want to highlight some of the key results from our work. And so we found that there were both internal and external factors that influence self-advocacy. And I won't go through all of them, but I'm just going to highlight a couple here. And so an internal factor was an aspect within an individual participant. And one of the internal factors that we found in our study was that identity could influence self-advocacy. And so participants who were underrepresented in terms of race and gender explained more challenges engaging in self-advocacy in their STEM courses. And I also want to be very clear, in our interview, we didn't explore how these same identities could also function as a support, but we hypothesized that that could also be occurring, and we encourage future research to look in that area. And we also found that there were external factors that influenced self-advocacy. And so this included other individuals, for example, peers, family, and DRC coordinators. And in particular, we found that peer comments could be very influential in supporting or hindering an individual's self-advocacy. We also found that how an accommodation is implemented, or what we called the logistics of the accommodations, could influence self-advocacy. And so just to share two examples of what that is, some of our participants described that they would decide not to use accommodations to avoid what we called like the exam day reveal. And so this is when a student maybe taking an exam offsite at the DRC, and they perceive that their peers will notice that they're gone on the day of the exam, and that creates a situation where then they have to explain where they were. And this can cause a loss of confidentiality for that student. And there were also instances when our participants said they decided not to use accommodations because they would rather be able to ask the instructor questions about the exam during the test, and that was something they didn't perceive they could easily do when they were testing offsite at the DRC. And there was another factor here. Oops, let's see. Yes, of course, the classroom environment. And so we found this to be a big influence on our participants' self-advocacy. So our participants described how STEM instructors can support and also hinder their self-advocacy. And so here, I'm just going to share 3 examples of some of the instructor-generated barriers that we found, but I'll encourage people to go look at our paper because there's a big table at the end where we highlight these barriers and offer some suggestions to overcome these barriers. And so one of the instructor-generated barriers we found was when instructors would discuss accommodations or accommodation issues openly in front of peers, and this caused a loss of confidentiality or a perceived loss of confidentiality for our participants. And this could make them feel less comfortable to, open up and talk about accommodations in the future when this happened. We also found instances when instructors would tell students that their accommodations would be difficult to implement in a lab or other STEM context. And when this happened, that really discouraged people from even requesting accommodations. And so, that was a barrier that we found. And, oops, sorry, my slides are a little bit laggy, I apologize. We also found instances when STEM instructors were using dismissive or hurtful language, for example, making jokes about being ADHD or being dyslexic in front of the class, and this hindered self-advocacy for our participants. And so those were just some of the results that we found. I wanted to be sure to acknowledge my co-authors in this work, Julio Cordero, Evie Ryder, McKenna Hendrickson, and Julie Stanton. And I wanted to thank our participants and our DRC partners, as well as our funding sources. And I also wanted to briefly introduce Dr. Julie Stanton, who is an associate professor of cellular biology at the University of Georgia. She was one of my co-major advisors, the advisor for this work, and a co-author on the paper. And she has graciously offered to help me answer questions in the Q&A today. Thank you so much, Julie.
Great, and thank you, Mariel, for that wonderful overview of your study. So I would like to encourage folks to go ahead and place comments and questions into the chat. But I'll begin just to kind of get the conversation going here. I would like to begin by asking you, Mariel, what were you most surprised to learn as a result of this research? Was there anything that was maybe necessarily unexpected, or just that you were surprised about in general?
Yeah, there was a lot that I was surprised about. I think, to be totally open, I was surprised that there were participants who weren't currently using accommodations that agreed to participate in our study. And so I thought that was a very valuable thing to learn from them, because we learned a lot about some of the barriers that we may not have seen if everyone had been currently using accommodations. I also think that, I used to be a DRC coordinator, and so for me, I was always really interested why students would, sign up to take a test at the DRC, but then at the last minute decide to go take the test somewhere else. And so learning about like the issues of the exam day reveal and being able to ask the instructor questions on the day of the exam like really resonated with me. And so those were some of, I guess, two examples of some of the unexpected things that we learned.
And as we wait for questions to come in, I do want to ask you a follow-up question to your experience with, as someone who worked in a disability resource center. Could you describe what that experience was like for you, forming this partnership with the DRC in order to conduct this research study?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I really loved working at a DRC. This was, I guess, to kind of explain how I got involved in that work. When I was an undergraduate, I started working, um, like helping out, what's the word? Like acquiring permission from publishing companies to make alternative textbooks. And so that was kind of where I started. But then I really took on a lot of different roles within the DRC. And so I'm just adding all this because it was something that I was really interested in, like pursuing as a career. And so when I was at the DRC, it became really apparent to me that like instructors want to be helpful in the process, but there's a lot of things that we don't know, like from the instructor side, right? Like there's a lot of insider knowledge that the DRC has about what students are experiencing that is not shared with the instructor. And so I kind of felt like there was like an area of overlap that could be helpful to bring my different perspectives. As a STEM undergraduate, I was familiar with some of the context that my students were experiencing. So, just as an example, my colleagues at the DRC, like when we would receive an exam, I could look and say, hey, we're missing the periodic table here. Like, this is not going to be like the student needs the periodic table to be able to complete the exam. And so, I guess I'm trying to say like that shared knowledge was really helpful. And forming a partnership with the DRC here was really rewarding. I think I had to, like, I perceived that there was a need to kind of prove myself, like, to kind of talk shop, if that makes sense, and to say, like, yeah, I'm familiar with what the accommodation process is like. And to really, I think that they did an excellent job, like, vetting to make sure that, like, this is someone that I want to work with and someone who is genuinely interested in supporting students. So I think, yeah, those are some of my experiences. But I would add that it has been a very productive and beneficial relationship, I think, for both parties. It's whenever you enter a collaboration, you want to make sure that the needs of both or all the people involved are being met. And so they've really helped me think about how to recruit participants for this work. But at the same time, they've asked, like, please share relevant results with us and to share like some of the knowledge that you gained from this study. And so that has been something that I've found really personally rewarding.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I have another DRC related question in the chat here. And that is your study addressed the students who are already registered with the DRC. And an important related question is how do we identify and support students who have not taken this first step?
Yeah, that is a really important question. Um, and so I think a lot of it has to do, I guess, coming from the STEM instructor perspective. I think that it is, being aware of your students and noticing um, some of the things that might be going on with them and thinking about like what you would do to support any student if they're experiencing a difficulty and offering, to connect that student to the relevant resources on campus is really a good starting point. And I really try to think about how STEM courses can be made more accessible to all students, and so thinking about bringing in some aspects of universal design for learning into your course can be a way to support these students. Yeah, I think those are some starting strategies there.
And we have a question that follows up on that from the instructor side, but how should instructors introduce accommodations on their first day of class? Is there more we should say because, or besides having a note on our syllabus with contact info for the DRC and saying they should let us know about accommodations that they may need? So considering the first day of class, what advice might you have?
Yeah, that is a really excellent question. And so, something we have tried in our own practice is to include an announcement that you, as a STEM instructor, fully support the use of accommodations in your course, and you're happy to talk to the student about accommodations or accommodation issues. And this can really open the door to inviting students to come and talk with you and to let them know, like, you support this, because certainly some students are making an assessment of whether you, as the instructor, support the use of accommodations or not in your course. And so just being very explicit about, yes, I do, I'm happy to help you in this process, is something that can increase the number of students who use accommodations or who request to use accommodations in your course.
And we have another question that's faculty or instructor related, but it's how can we help educate faculty about the barriers faced by students? I hear a lot of faculty speaking in a deficit way about any student that needed extended time or needed accommodations and such.
Yeah, that is a really good question. Um, I think I think what it really boils down to is a lack of awareness about what that experience is like. And something that has always stuck with me is one of my colleagues once offered this advice, thinking about your ultimate favorite student. What would you be willing to do for that person? And then offering that to all of your students. And so I think that is one avenue to think about improving faculty reception, or like trying to think more from an asset-based approach as opposed to a deficit-based approach. Yeah.
Absolutely. And we have a question here about the logistics of the study. So was this study conducted pre-pandemic? And then if depending on that, how do you think the pandemic has either helped or hindered disability accommodation?
Oh, yeah, for sure. So this study was conducted pre-pandemic. Um, and in terms of the pandemic, I'll lean into some of Logan's work, his recent paper. It sounds like it was more challenging as a result of the pandemic. But, it's kind of interesting to think about, maybe now people are more aware of what it takes to get an accommodation or not. And so maybe that could be something that we leverage in the future to help people think more inclusively about the use of accommodations in STEM courses.
Yeah, I think that's a goal of mine as well. It's something that I would really like to see. Now we have a question considering the participant views of how their disability impacted self-advocacy. So a question here says, could you elaborate on how participants' view of disability impacted their self-advocacy? How could that inform supports for students?
Yeah. So in our study, we saw that participants who held a more positive view of their disability, and so they would make statements like, this is just a part of who I am. Whereas other participants would tend to describe like being embarrassed about having ADHD or SLD. And so those people who felt more positive about their own disability appeared to be more willing to seek out knowledge that supported their self-advocacy. And so a lot of our participants who had negative views of their disability held a lot of inaccurate ideas about the accommodation process. Um, and so, that was an interesting relationship to see in the data. And I apologize, Logan, I forgot the second part of that question.
Yeah, the second part is essentially how would that impact the supports for students in terms of maybe what supports can be available for them?
Okay. Yeah. So, in terms of supports, I think that uh, I guess I should also talk about kind of the flip side of view of disability. So, it was also how people perceived others to think about ADHD or SLD. And so, I think one thing that's really important is for instructors to consider the language that they're using to talk about, or, I guess what happened a lot in our study was that our participants would hear instructors making jokes about, oh, like that was so ADHD of me, or I misspelled a word. I'm dyslexic. That was really damaging to like how the participant saw their STEM instructor. And so I think it's really important to keep that in mind. And the language that you're using in your course is setting a precedent and can be informing how people think you see those disabilities. And so that is one support that comes to mind, is being really cognizant of the language that we're using. I also think, emphasizing this idea that, we all are different, like we all have different strengths and weaknesses. And so trying to come from more of an asset based approach would be helpful in that conversation as well.
Absolutely. Um, Now I have a question. Thinking about study design and approaching your study, what advice might you give to a researcher looking to do an interview study for the very first time? It's a study perhaps similar to the work that you've done.
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of big points that I would want to hit with this question. One of them would be to really, do your work in the literature to make sure that you're asking interview questions that are going to provide something new. Um, you know, Doing an interview study is a big commitment on your end as a researcher, but also your participants. And so I think it's really important to be sure that you're optimizing the time that you have and really asking the questions that need to be asked. And so I am a big proponent of piloting your interview protocol and changing your interview questions as needed to optimize the data that you're getting. And trying to be very critical with yourself as if this data will address the research questions that you're asking. Um, so those are some of kind of the mechanics of it. In terms of participant recruitment, I would offer that it's always going to probably take longer than you think it will. And so it's good to keep that in mind. I think at one point, Julie may remember this. We recruited 12 participants, I think, in one semester, then 13 the next. But after that first semester, I was like, we are never going to make it. We'll never get to the end point. And so, yeah, I think being flexible and then being open to trying a different recruitment approach if needed is also important. Um, and I guess with that theme of it's going to take longer than you think, I learned pretty quickly like scheduling 3 interviews in one day is really challenging for me, but scheduling 2 is more realistic. Because certainly doing an interview is like a different level of active listening. So for me, it's hard to do more than 2 in a day. And Julie, do you have anything else that you would offer for that question?
No, I think you did a great job of explaining how you want to go into the literature. And then, one of the things that we did was really make sure we knew what our research questions were and we understood how each question in the protocol aligned with those questions we hope to answer overall. And it wound up being where both you and I thought, well, there could be a lovely paper out of this work. And actually, there's going to be 3 because the data were so rich. And we tried to write a really big paper and we had to cut it in 2. And then we tried to write the second paper. And, all of them are quite long. So I think that the work that you did to ensure that the protocol was going to provide you with data that would allow you to answer the research questions was really critical.
And we do have a question here in the chat that is related, and something that I was intrigued by is I think the question here says, I think you mentioned having researchers or a researcher or researchers in your team who had lived experiences with ADHD and SLD. Can you talk about how you think this changed your study and the approach to the work?
Yeah, that is a really great question. And so I would offer, you know, without that lived experience, probably part of and within this particular paper, in the supplemental file, there is information about how family and DRC coordinators support and hinder self-advocacy. And at one point, we were asked by reviewers to cut out some of the length because it is a long paper. But our team really felt strongly that that was an important piece of the experience. Um, and I agree because, I think from the STEM instructor's point of view, sometimes you think, okay, like this individual student is working really well right now with their DRC coordinator. And that's not always the case, and that can make self-advocacy more challenging. And so that's a specific example, like within this work. But certainly, as Julie was mentioning, there's going to be another paper from this study, and there was a lot of really valuable insights that were provided from our team that is helping to contextualize that paper that will be submitted soon.
And I want to follow that up with another question to you that as what originally motivated you to begin studying self-advocacy in the first place?
Yeah, so I think I kind of have some different lenses. I'll be a qualitative researcher and say that there's some different lenses that I'm going to take to answer this question. The first one, I guess the one that maybe people can see right now is like for sure that I have a professional interest in self-advocacy that's really coming from my experience as a DRC coordinator. And in this role, I think I really got to see how the accommodation system can serve students well, but also the many ways that it does not serve students well. And anytime, we were talking to new students in our program or we were talking to parents, like kind of what we would say is like, oh, as long as you're a student or you're practicing self-advocacy, it's going to be fine. And I don't think that is necessarily the case because as I gained more experience from the coordinator standpoint and working with students, I began to see that we don't really know what self-advocacy is. And there's a lot of things that influence it. So it's not like this cut and dry kind of thing. So that was some of my motivation from the DRC lens, my professional lens. I would also offer that I was a middle school science teacher for a little bit, and I also did student teaching. And I noticed in those meetings, I would attend IEP meetings with students with disabilities. And I began to notice it was pretty rare, at least in the schools I was working in, for the student to attend their own accommodation meetings. And then when I became a coordinator, I was really struck by this like stark contrast or like how much different it is from high school to college, where, like a few years before the student may not have even been attending their own accommodation meetings. And then now, like they're on the other side of the table from me and I'm, it's really supposed to be a negotiation. And so that was another interest that I had in this area. And then finally, I also have a personal motivation to study this area. I've seen very close family members navigate the educational system, the social security disability system, and the healthcare system, and seeing how important self-advocacy is in those contexts as well. And so for those reasons, those are some of my motivations to pursue this area.
Great. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Mariel. I do have a question here from an attendee about accommodation specifically, and what do you do when an accommodation isn't compatible with your class, such as an accommodation that says the student cannot be expected to talk or present in class, perhaps when that class is heavy discussion or presentation based, for example.
Yeah, so that is a good question and something that definitely comes up, working with students in the accommodation system. And so if you as an instructor feel that an accommodation request fundamentally alters the nature of your program, you should email the student's DRC coordinator to see what types of arrangements or, what other things can be put in place, because sometimes there might be another option. So I've heard of, for example, like in terms of presentations, some accommodations are for the student to record a presentation before time and then, play the recording of that. That can be one strategy, but for sure that's not the only strategy. And I would offer that it's important to include the DRC coordinator and the student in that conversation. And so that is how I would recommend handling that situation.
And considering the DRC side of things here, another attendee asked, have DRC resources always been available on campuses? I feel like I could have used accommodations when I went to college 20 years ago, but I didn't know any of these services and struggled in college. When did these services start on campus?
Oh, that is a really good question. Um, so I'm not for sure about this answer, but I imagine that I think it's probably been around. Um, I would offer maybe so the two major laws that guide the accommodation process in college. The first one is the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and the second one, of course, is the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. And so I imagine that there was some sort of office prior to 1990, but I would offer, like, I could imagine that that would be maybe more like student housing type of accommodations. I think if I were to guess, it would be sometime after the ADA got passed, that we began to see more actual centers or offices on campus. Um, yeah, and I would offer too, like, that has been some of my close family members' experiences as well. And Logan, I might ask you, do you know when more offices started to appear on college campuses?
I would agree with you that that some might have been put in place in 73, but then 90 was probably the push to make them kind of universal across campuses. I think one important thing is potentially the names of these offices could be different, where maybe before the 90s it was not disability services or disability resources, but then post 90s they became that. But now there's movements to change to more of like inclusive learning services or accessibility resources and such, which I think is an important note to add to that conversation as well.
Yeah, I agree. I like the accessibility services. I think, like, if I could change the name, that's what I would like it to be.
It is interesting though, to try to be more inclusive of mental health, for example, that students with mental health conditions could be able to access those same resources, which is just I think an important conversation piece. Um, Then we do have a question from an attendee here, considering how do we explain to faculty that a student's likelihood to self-advocate is not equivalent to their self-motivation in STEM courses? So the difference between, likelihood to self-advocate and self-motivation.
Yeah, that is a good question. I'm taking a moment here to think about it. Um, so I think that a student can be highly motivated to succeed in their STEM courses, and they have a record of succeeding in their STEM courses. But once, they might be experiencing an environment where it becomes much harder for them to practice self-advocacy. And I'm thinking about some of the results in our paper. So, for example, some of our participants described where they felt really comfortable using accommodations and talking to the instructor in their introductory level courses because they were so large. And so they felt that they could be more confidential. But as the classes get smaller and smaller and smaller, they perceive their peers to really notice where they're, like, if they're not there at the day of the exam. And they also can begin to worry about how their peers might be their coworkers in the future. And so some of those bigger questions begin to come into play. And so maybe that is a helpful example of how we could help our administrators think more about, or faculty think more about, why there might be reluctance to practice self-advocacy. are some of the suggestions I have there.
To follow that up with another practical question, as many folks here might be STEM instructors. So as a STEM instructor, how might I be able to support the self-advocacy process for students for my students with disabilities in my classes?
Yeah. So I think first of all, it's really important that you as a STEM instructor understand your own role in the accommodation process at your university. And so taking some time to become familiar with like what the different accommodations are, and like what that might require from you. So for example, like when we think about a testing accommodation, are you responsible to fill out the paperwork, or is the student supposed to bring that to you? When do you need to send a copy of the exam to the Disability Resource Center? How will you answer student exam questions that come up? Thinking of some of those kind of more practical questions is one way, because a lot of students are still developing their self-advocacy knowledge. So this process is also very new to them, or it can be very new to them. And so some of the issues that come up, when we think about self-advocacy, is that the student doesn't yet know what the instructor's role is supposed to be, but a lot of times they're put in a place where they have to also teach the instructor their role in the process. And so I think as STEM instructors, that's something that we have some control over. How much we know about our own accommodation process at our university is one option. I think it's also important to think about increasing our own knowledge of student experiences. And so seeking out opportunities to talk with students. I know here and at some other universities, there's like here it's called the Speakers Bureau, but these are representatives from, like student representatives from the DRC, who actually go around and give like informational talks and talk about what it's like for them in different STEM or in different courses. And so I think a lot of times some of the issues that come up, I would offer is maybe more like this idea of like you don't know, like you're kind of inadvertently hindering people's self-advocacy because of like our own lack of information or knowledge. And so doing some of those things can be ways to remedy that.
And that segues nicely into a question we have in the Q&A, which is there a better way to start a conversation about self-advocacy in a small class that starts online? I want to encourage discussion and help seeking behaviors, especially troubleshooting in science and bioinformatics, but I don't want to discourage or spotlight.
Yeah. Yeah, Logan, can you read the first part of that
Yeah,
question?
so is there a better way to start a conversation about self-advocacy? And it looks like specifically in the context of a small online class at the beginning.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess I'm imagining maybe like two possible scenarios. And so I think one way is to offer, maybe more detailed information about how accommodations could work in your online course would be one example. So, one of the misconceptions or inaccurate ideas discussed by our participants was that accommodations were not available for online courses. And so being very clear, like, yeah, accommodations are available, and then explaining, one question students may be having is, okay, do I need to talk to the instructor about this, or do I need to talk to the DRC about this? And so if you can kind of point them into like who will actually be adding the extra time on the online exam, that could be helpful. And then the other scenario that came to my mind was maybe there's a particular student who you're wanting to talk more about self-advocacy with. And so there, I think just kind of checking in with the student and saying, hey, I'm noticing these issues. Is there anything, would you like to meet to talk about them? That could be something that could be helpful, if it's that type of scenario.
So now we have a question from an attendee. You touched on this briefly in your overview, but they asked specifically, the demographics of my college has changed to include more first-generation students, Hispanic and Black students. Were your results different for minority students or first-gen students? How can we help support and retain these students who may not know how to navigate these services or college in general?
Oh, this is a really good question. And so, one of the things we found in our study was that students who were underrepresented in terms of gender and race explained more challenges practicing self advocacy. And a lot of this had to do with comfort in communicating with STEM instructors. And so I think, taking some steps to make sure that people feel comfortable talking with you about these kind of sensitive issues is one strategy. And then in terms of first generation students, I would just share that in our study, families are a big support of self-advocacy. And so some of our participants talked about how their sisters or brothers or their mom and dad also use accommodations. And so they were able to access some of that knowledge about like what accommodations can I request, what accommodations might be helpful, like how does this process really work. And so I think making some of that information more explicit to, the student body at large could be really helpful. One idea could be to offer maybe remote workshops or remote sessions where people can kind of anonymously learn about the accommodation process and what services are offered, could be an idea. And I think also working within existing support systems can be really helpful. And so like if a student is already plugged into, I think TRIO programs, I was a first generation student, and so I was able to access a TRIO program, and they were really helpful about connecting us to other types of services. And so I think, looking at what's already existing and then thinking about, okay, how can we offer some more information for participants in these programs could be powerful.
And I have a follow-up question to that, but how, if at all, have the results of your work informed DRC practices at the institution where the data was collected, for example?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we were really fortunate to have the opportunity to talk with like the senior leadership team of the Student Affairs Department about our work. And so one thing that came up in our study was that participants were expressing a desire to access academic coaching. And there's actually a Department of Academic Enhancement at our institution. And so my understanding is that there was work done to expand this service to more students and to advertise it explicitly at the DRC, so people who were already using accommodations were aware that they could access an academic coach if they wanted to by talking to people at the DAE office. That's one way. And I guess the other thing that we talked about with the DRC was some of the issues with the note-taking services. So in our study, we found that many of our participants reported not receiving notes in a timely manner or low quality notes. And so that was something that we were able to talk with them about.
And have you had any efforts to expand this beyond the institution's DRC to other DRCs or other institutional context, or expand your work broadly?
Yeah, not yet, but that is something that we hope to work on in the future.
And I have a question here, kind of a big picture question, but what are maybe one or two systemic changes that could occur to better support students with ADHD or specific learning disorders?
Yeah, let's see. I think what immediately comes to my mind right now in this post-COVID world is a lot of the testing centers now for people to get registered are very backed up. And so I wish that there could be like a, kind of changing or not changing the criteria, but being more aware of this and how it's affecting people's ability to access accommodations in college, I think is important. That's one change that could be helpful. And I also think that changing some of the language for like the DRC names could be helpful for students. Some of our participants explained, when they see the word disability in the name of the office, it can cause them pause to, decide if they want to be registered or not. And so those are maybe two suggestions. And I know we talked about that a little bit earlier too.
And we do have a question in the chat that's a bit of a clarifying question to the first point that you made, but it's: do students need a formal medical diagnosis to get these accommodations? What if a student just wants extended time due to test taking anxiety, but perhaps they don't have an anxiety diagnosis from a doctor? And I want to add just further to that: how might we support a student like that latter situation?
Yeah. So, yes, to receive formal accommodations, there does need to be some level of documentation of that condition. And I'll just offer it can be very varied across different institutions about what counts and what does not count. And so it's really about how folks are interpreting the law. So I would just offer, at most institutions, and I believe this is required with the amendments to the ADA, you cannot deny someone accommodations based on an inability to produce that documentation. So I just say that because there can be a situation where if there is sufficient evidence from other areas, and it would depend on that particular DRC, what that counts as, that person can access informal accommodations or temporary accommodations, but it's usually not very extensive. So there's a little bit of nuance there, but that is how I would answer that question. So yes, it does require some form of documentation, but that documentation can vary depending on institution. And there should still be a mechanism to receive informal or temporary accommodations if it's due to, if the person is having trouble getting formal documentation because of, COVID wait times or something like that. So I guess in terms of testing anxiety, I think you as an instructor can really think about, like, what are you able to offer that student that may not be an informal accommodation. And I guess that kind of goes back to that point I offered earlier where, if you imagine your favorite student, like, what would you do for them? And then thinking about how you can offer that to all of your students.
And I think we have time for just about one more question. I don't have any queued in the chat, but I do want to ask, for the students who may have difficulties getting diagnoses, do you know of any particular initiatives or ways to potentially support those students as they navigate that process of the diagnostic testing? As you said, the wait times may be longer, or they're backed up and such. How might we support that student in the process as they're kind of negotiating and kind of self-advocating for that particular diagnostic test?
Yeah, that is a really good question. So something that has come up in our study, some students were able to access scholarships to help them pay for the process of testing because it is also expensive to get tested. And so looking to see if there's resources on campus. And again, I would offer just to maybe start with like the TRIO programs at your institution to see if there's those types of supports there. And then I think, more maybe not coming from the money side of it, but just the long time that it can take to get a diagnosis. I think, I don't know if I have a good answer for that one because it's a tough situation to be in. I would offer like thinking about what you as the instructor can do that's fair to all the students in your class that could maybe support that individual student, but also offering, emotional support or being willing just to talk to that person about what that experience is like so that person feels heard and validated and like acknowledgement that is a really tough process to go through. I don't think that's a great answer. I wish I had a better answer, but unfortunately, like that's really how our system is built at this time. And so, maybe in the future we can think about ways to improve that for folks.
Absolutely. Great. Well, I do want to Well, thank you for your time here and presenting here. I want to walk us through for the last 5 minutes through a reflection exercise. So, if Mariel, if you would like to share your final slides here, we want folks who've attended this webinar to consider one thing that they found to be interesting that they learned, that you all learned as part of today's webinar series. So let's take just a few moments and then go ahead and place those ideas into the chat box. One interesting thing that you learned from today's webinar. And we did get a question in the chat that Julie answered that yes, a recording of this webinar will be posted to the ASCB website. So some of those ideas are coming through the chat. Great, and thank you everyone for reflecting and contributing those ideas. I would like to also say in closing here, suggestions for topics and feature papers that we should discuss with our Online with LSE webinar series. So if Mariel, if you would go to the next slide, we would just like for folks to potentially drop in paper links or ideas for future future webinar series. And then I would like to remind folks to mark your calendars for the next Online with LSE, which is going to be Friday, January 28th, which is going to be on science identity among Latinx students in biomedical sciences and the role of critical race theory informed undergraduate research experience. So with that, I want to give a thank you to Mariel Pfeifer for sharing her work with us, along with Julie Stanton for joining us, as well as Ashanti and the rest of ASCB for their work in organizing this event. And I really want to thank you all as participants for coming to join us. And we hope to see everyone on Friday, January 20th. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.